First of all, may I introduce our first speaker, who is Patrick Mulholland. Patrick is a Deputy General Secretary of NIPSA and would like to say a few words of introduction. Patrick, over to you.
Well, thank you, Kim. First of all, colleagues, can I just say it is a real pleasure to be at this launch, and I think it is a great boon to NIPSA that the launch has taken place. Just to touch on a number of points, folks, first of all, can I just congratulate a number of people for the work that has gone into this. Kim, Sheena, John McVeigh and John McCaffrey, I think, have done a sterling job in putting this together, along with Professor Smith, who has provided the backbone and a bit of intellectual weight to it, for which we are grateful. But underpinning all of this, comrades, are the panels, the branches and the activists who are engaged in a daily struggle to maintain and support our housing executive. And for that, I have to say NIPSA is extremely grateful, but also I think the wider community as well for the work that's gone into it. So thank you for that. And I just want to make a couple of points myself on what I think, where exactly the future of the housing executive should fit in the politics and the economy of Northern Ireland, and I suppose the wider economy as well. The way I look at the housing executive is that the housing executive was one of the great achievements of the working class. It, alongside the National Health Service and universal education, were three great achievements in Northern Ireland that changed things fundamentally for working class families, for working class communities, for working class people. It took the sharp edge of capitalism for very many people. It did not remove capitalism, obviously, it didn't resolve it, but it did help to take the sharp edge of it. I am one of those who, as a parent who is still of the age who remembers life before the housing executive, and my mother would speak very highly of the executive and what it achieved when it was brought in. She would remember the days when a family got married, or two people got married and began a family. They normally began that in a rented room in somebody else's house. That was the housing reality of Northern Ireland. And the housing executive moved us away from those terrible housing conditions. So it was one of those great achievements, I think, that did change society for the better. But we also have to say that great achievement was never acceptable to the capitalist class. It was never acceptable to those with money, and it was never acceptable to Northern Ireland's politicians or politicians across the water from that point of view either, because they had a different perspective on it. From their point of view, a little bit like the health service and a little bit like universal education, the housing executive represented profit that should have been in their pocket rather than a benefit and a boon to society in general. So like the health service, like the education system, the housing executive was under siege from day one and was under attack from day one. It has been constantly pummeled by private interests. It's been constantly pummeled by those who represent the landlord class in this society, and it continues to be pummeled. But due to the massive resistance of ordinary people, due to the massive resistance of trade unions like NIPSA, the housing executive is still standing on its feet. The idea of public housing is still out there, and we are determined to continue that resistance into the future. But NIPSA's aim has to not just be to defend the housing stock that exists and the housing executive as it exists today, but to aim towards a massive expansion of that stock, a massive expansion of public housing for all the people, so everybody in the future can be in a situation where they're no longer beholden to a private landlord, that they have a house and a home that they can call their own. So I think this document takes us a significant step down that road. The document is primarily a document about defending the housing executive and pushing back against privatisation. But in doing so, we also set out the steps for the future for housing provision that really does suit the people. Comrades, NIPSA as a trade union has in its objectives a socialist economy. The health service, universal education, and the housing executive do not make for a socialist economy, but they do illustrate what is possible in a genuinely democratic socialist economy that is run for the people. They give an example, they give a taste of it, and it's something we should fight to preserve into the future. So, comrades, it's been a tremendous achievement so far on the part of NIPSA's branches in the housing sector to defend what we have. Let's make sure we keep up that good work into the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Patrick. I'd just like to say a few words now by way of background as to where we've come from and why we are where we are now and why we're actually launching this paper. In November 2020, a ministerial announcement signalled that the housing executive in Northern Ireland would undergo a restructuring that could result in its landlord function status changing from being public sector to a mutual type organisation separated from the rest of the housing executive. But in March 2021, the Housing Minister, Deirdre Hargey, appeared to roll back from this proposal. And there has been no concrete plan clarified since then, other than the plan to deliver over 100,000 homes over the next 15-year period. Now, the current potential plans for the reform of public housing, entitled by the Department for Communities as Revitalisation of the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, remain top secret to date, with departmental officials' recommendations sitting under ministerial consideration since several weeks before the recent election. This is despite NIPSA writing to the Minister, calling for openness, transparency, and an opportunity to engage with her on the recommendations. However, recent DFC public consultation policy documents, including the intermediate rent model and the draft housing supply strategy, have indicated a prerequisite reliance upon private or third sector funding and operating models as well to meet housing objectives in Northern Ireland. NIPSA is fundamentally opposed to the spectre of privatisation for public housing in Northern Ireland. And I would now like to introduce the author of our new briefing paper, Professor Stuart Smith, who holds a chair in accounting at Sheffield University Management School. Stuart has written extensively about social housing in Britain, with particular emphasis on financing and policy implications. He is also the author of our 3 previous research reports for NIPSA on the future of the Northern Ireland Housing Executive and anti-privatisation publications. I will now hand over to Stuart, who will explain why we are so fundamentally opposed to privatisation of public housing across Northern Ireland. And he will make clear that there are better options possible where there is the political will for positive change. Stuart, over to you.
Cheers, Kim, and thanks very much as well to Patrick for the introduction note about the future of the housing executive. And what I want to do over the next kind of 15 minutes or so is just go through, and some of you will have heard me speak about this before, and Patrick actually mentioned the importance of the history and understanding where the housing executive came from. And so I will talk about that and how actually the housing executive represented a huge step forward and was a positive development for the lives of very many working class people across Northern Ireland over a 20, even 30-year period, and how those challenges are now being, how that progress is now being challenged by indifference, one element of it amongst our political class. We'll then talk about privatisation and what does privatisation of public housing mean, and we'll talk a little bit about the idea that it's not a single event but a process, and we'll talk about the privatisation as a fancy wrapper, this idea that actually just because it's the housing is moving towards a not-for-profit, even cooperative organisation doesn't mean that it's not privatisation, it's just put a different wrapper around it. And we'll talk a little bit about this idea about financialised privatisation and about how privatisation is different today than it was in the 1980s and the 1990s. So just very briefly, the origins of the housing executive comes from the civil rights movement in the late 1960s. Actually, the housing movement predates the civil rights movement by a year, 18 months or so, had the one aim of challenging the discrimination of housing allocations that was happening, that was recognised even by the British government in the Cameron Report in 1969, and had the idea of saying we want fair allocations on the basis of need right across society. And that's where the housing executive actually came from, taking it away from the gerrymandered local authorities and the discrimination that was faced in allocations there. And it was a success story. I don't intend, you can have a read through those. Some of you will have heard me talk about this before. It was very much a success story. If we just look at two of these bullet points, in 1974, just after the housing executive had kind of fully become operational and had taken the housing stock over 150,000 homes under its wing, it had some of the worst condition housing stock anywhere in Europe. 1 in 5 homes, 20% of homes, were considered unfit for occupation. You fast forward 13 years, and because of the developments, because of the good work that was done by the housing executive, because it was funded appropriately, because they were left to get on with the job of providing decent, affordable homes for people. By 1987, that ratio had gone down to 1 in 12 homes were in poor condition or unfit for occupation. So there is a definite success story to tell here in the early decades of the housing executive, and even, you know, the group organizations like PwC, the accounting and management consulting group, whose default position is to advise about privatization of everything and the public sector is bad and private sector is good. In their report in 2011 about the housing executive, they say that it's a success story. It's rightly regarded nationally and internationally as a leading authority on best practice, both in housing management and community building. But that, unfortunately, that's not being maintained. You might have seen on one of the slides previously, there was a bullet point about in the middle of the 1990s, the political decision was taken to stop the housing executive from building new homes, and that funding instead was actually diverted into the not-for-profit sector, into housing associations. And in the interim, so that takes away a crucial capacity for the housing executive to be able to deliver publicly owned, publicly rented homes for everybody across society. And at the same time, then we face, it's the classic kind of, you know, death by 1,000 cuts, that the funding is held below inflation levels or small cuts year on year on year. So as by the time we get to 2017, and a leaked letter by the permanent secretary, Leo O'Reilly, where he estimates that by 2020, if there isn't a reformed and renewed investments in the housing executive, that they would have to start divesting from approximately half of the portfolio. Otherwise, the organisation as a whole would not be financially sustainable. So we've gone from this position where over the 70s and the 80s and into the 90s, the housing executive is financially sustainable, is doing great work in terms of improving the housing stock. And then over the last quarter of a century, we've had these a combination of political indifference and then this creating of, you know, this, to use Naomi Klein's ideas about disaster capitalism, we have this now huge backlog of repairs that need to be addressed, that have built up over 20 years. And so the solution that's being portrayed at different times is to one form or another of privatizing the housing executive. So where I'll just talk about the current one, obviously, which is the main focus on the of the briefing note. And the current idea was put forward by Minister Nikulon in November 2020. where the intention was to classify the housing executive as a mutual or a cooperative. And the idea then is, in essence, what you're doing is you're moving the housing executive out of the public sector, you're putting it into the private sector for government accounting purposes. That then would allow the housing executive to borrow from the private sector, etc., and it wouldn't count against government borrowing rules. There was really very little detail, though, behind that. We had I've read the speech and you know, on Hansard several times, and the questions that came forward from it. But other than saying nothing is going to change except we're going to classify it as a housing mutual or cooperative, there wasn't any substantive work done underneath. And so a series of questions that were asked by MLAs, written questions asked of the minister by MLAs over the following months, by and large, most of them got this kind of response that we see here from Minister Hargey in December 2020, where it's at early stages, the officials have commenced work to look at options, and the intention is to bring proposals by the end of the mandate. So there wasn't a lot, there was a lot of attention grabbed at the time, but there wasn't a lot of detail behind actually what does this mean. And in particular, there are some really hard political decisions that need to be taken to make the housing executive sustainable again. So in this area, when we didn't have any details about what it would look like, or how reclassification would work, one of the things that came out was this example of the BYKER Community Trust. Professor Peter Roberts, who's the chair of the housing executive, was involved with BCT before, and saw this as a way of actually developing the housing executive. Now, one of the things to remember, of course, is BYKER is a single estate in one city in Newcastle, in England. There is a certain, I always thought there was a certain kind of inappropriateness, maybe even naivety involved in thinking that you could take the model from one estate and apply it to an organisation that has 80,000 plus homes right across the whole of the north of the island. But even taking that into consideration, this is one of the points that we picked up on in an earlier report, where the concern about privatisation isn't that it's just one single event, but that it happens over a period of time, and over time this process and these factors unfold. And so you have a classic example here where BCT was established in 2012 as a community trust with elements of input from the tenants, but by 9 years later it had been taken over by a much bigger group, Carbon Homes, right, that has operations right across England. And Carbon Homes describes itself as a profit for a purpose organisation. So it's not even describing itself as a not-for-profit organisation. They now deliberately go out and make profits, but then we'll say, well, we're putting this back into the community. Carbon Homes works on the basis of this kind of complex group organisation, only one of which is actually a cooperative. Most of them are limited companies that will make profits, and there are a range of issues around that maybe we'll pick up in the discussion. But the one that I wanted to talk mainly about is this idea that over half of Carbon Homes finance comes in the form of a corporate bond. So these corporate bonds are actually what is traded on the stock exchanges. Right. So this is where we're getting into this organisation on one side is saying we are profit for a purpose, but the logics behind it are all about financial logics, about making returns to the finance providers, etc. All right. So what is that's one possible future that could be opened out. When you trawl through the answers to the written questions that were put forward by the MLAs, we get to this position where we've got the minister saying in March 2021, as Kim mentioned, that her preference would be to keep the housing executive with its current classification. But what we end up with then is we can infer these kinds of preferences so that we all accept that the housing executive must be allowed to borrow again. And we accept that such borrowing must occur without taking existence, or certainly, sorry, the minister accepts that takes the position that it must occur without actually hitting the capacity of other government departments to borrow, particularly health and schools. At the same time, there should be minimum change, and the housing executive's current classification should be retained. The problem that we have with all of this is that in order to do 1 and 2, right, to borrow and for it not to hit against government capacity, those contradict 3 and 4. Right? And this is the fundamental tension that is there in actually how we move forward with the housing executive, not just the minister's proposals, but potentially all proposals. And of course, what happens here is the crucial bit of this, the technical bit of this, is the people who will decide this actually aren't in Stormont, aren't in the departments, either of communities or the Department of Finance, but are in the ONS, the Office for National Statistics. They're the people who decide what organisations are in the public sector and what organisations are in the private sector. And what they look at is this idea about control and who has a last say over important decisions. And these boundaries are quite fluid, and anybody who knows some of the history of what happened with housing associations over the last 10 years will see that the housing associations were originally considered to be off the books. They were reviewed in 2016 and they were then considered to be put on the books and reclassified. And then the Housing Amendment Act in 2020 was put in and reduced the control that the minister has enough to satisfy the ONS that the housing associations were again back off the books. So we've got this kind of hokey-cokey that's gone on with housing associations. So we talked a little bit about privatisation with a fancy wrapper, that these are privatisations that are happening. This is what has happened across Britain whenever public housing and council housing is moved over to housing associations. It's been set on a journey. And I like this quote from Norman Ginsberg because it highlights the true privatizations see public control and public accountability fading away over time. And we can see this here in these couple of diagrams. So some of you may recognize this. This is the group structure, if you like, or the governance structure for the housing executive, where we have in the middle here the Housing Executive Board, who is accountable to the Department for Communities and Minister, who is in turn accountable to the Northern Ireland Assembly. Of course, we've got a secondary accountability off here again in the public sector because you need an accounting officer to follow the money through because there's public funds involved, and that accounting officer within the Housing Executive is accountable to the Permanent Secretary of the Department for Communities. If the housing executive is reclassified, those two accountabilities are broken. That they have to be broken in order to satisfy the ONS rules. So the Housing Executive Board will no longer be accountable to the Minister or to the Assembly, and the Chief Executive Accounting Officer will no longer be accountable to the Permanent Secretary in DFC. Instead, what we get is this scepter of financialised privatisation occurring, because just because they're not accountable to the minister or to the permanent secretary, they are going to be accountable to somebody else. And what ends up happening is they become accountable to the private finance providers. And we've seen this happen time and time again over the water in England, Scotland, and Wales, where they've done these various different forms of transfers, even to mutuals and to cooperatives. Ultimately, it's about giving access to the private finance to get their hands on sustainable assets that's going to give them a steady, reliable return. But they are the people who will be calling the shots. And it's not, you know, it's not like they say this is what you must do. The power is much softer here. But in short, what we end up is this more commercialized, more financialized. Right. And again, a lovely quote there from Manuel Albers about financialized privatizations, these semi-public institutions, private organizations with public goals that get entangled in a web of debt and financial derivatives. So just to finish off, last couple of slides, we've focused on the financial aspects of reclassification for two reasons. It's the borrowing rules that are driving this, and that reclassification unleashes these and privatisation unleashes these processes of financialisation and financial logics. Right? Whereas previously, when we talked about privatizations, traditional privatizations, it was about selling the shares. It was about taking, British Gas and BT and all the nationalized industries and selling shares out and delivering then dividends out to shareholders that previously would have stayed in the public purse. Today, in the 21st century, in the third decade of the 21st century, we don't get those privatizations in the same way. Instead, we get this privatization where it's about finance providers, debt providers extracting profits, extracting returns from lending in the form of corporate bonds, etc. Okay, so I think key to understanding the policy proposals, both now and actually whatever ones come out in the future, is to look at the role of private capital finance, to look at the financial logics. There are hard choices, whatever way this works, because of the indifference for a quarter of a century, for a quarter of a century, because we've got this backlog of repairs and maintenance that needs to happen. There are hard political choices about where the money comes from, but it is a political choice. And there is a role here as well for campaigning. We talked about it right at the very beginning with the civil rights movement being the campaigning that led to the formation of the housing executive in the first place. We've had the campaigns recently where the small-scale stock transfers, were the ballots that happened on the estates, like at the Grange, were beaten back overwhelming numbers voting to stay with the housing executive, because the campaigns were put in place, because tenants were shown there are two alternatives here, and what a transfer to a private body means. All right, we've laid out some recommendations, policy recommendations at the end of the briefing note. And I just want to finish off because with a quote here from the BEST report, again looking at the future of housing generally in Northern Ireland in 2009. And the BEST report, Lord Best there, brings out how important the housing executive is, not just for the people who are tenants there, but for the whole of housing and all the housing issues that are faced across Northern Ireland, because you have this significant player who can actually take on great roles and actually do work in terms of building new homes, in terms of developing, in terms of the repairs and maintenance that have knock-on impacts that go way beyond anything that any individual housing association may be able to do. So that's what is at stake here. Has been, it was in 2009 and still is now in 2022. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Stuart. That's a real insight into the key points that we have within the briefing paper, and we'll certainly be using the paper to lobby extensively and explain to people who don't seem to understand what this actually could mean and what that type of privatisation means for public sector organisations into the future, maybe not just limited to the housing executive. So many thanks for your excellent insight into the Spectre privatisation briefing paper, copies of which will be available for download from the NIPSA website and will be emailed out to those who have attended following this launch. I would now like to introduce you to Mr. John McVeigh, who is NIPSA's Policy and Research Officer, and John would like to add some further context to the briefing paper. John, over to you.
Thanks very much, Kim, and good afternoon, everyone. I just want to make a few broad points to supplement Stuart's analysis and to stress that not only is it important that we draw upon his expertise on the specifics of immediate housing policy and the future of the housing executive, I think it's also vital that we root what we are arguing for in the fundamental question of what housing policy should be about and where it should fit in terms of the provision of public services. And I think it's also important to remember in this context that Housing was one of the building blocks of social security in its fullest sense, and housing provision has a wider role in creating a just and healthy society. This was part of the vision of the post-war welfare state, and it was a project striving to give us social security from the cradle to the grave. And we should remember, for example, that the Minister for Health, Nye Bevan, who founded the NHS, was Minister for Health and Housing. In other words, he and the other social visionaries who created the NHS saw health as only one part of a society, the needs of which had to be addressed through eradicating all of the 5 giant evils of the Hungry 30s. And those were want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. By complete contrast, the dominant political ideology of the last 40 years underlying the current housing crisis has unpicked this key seam in the fabric of society, with the long-term repercussion of this neoliberal approach still continuing to dominate all our lives. As its latest iteration, a cost of living crisis shows, marketization doesn't work. Those who support such an ideology have had a 40-year free reign, and if their vision was capable of delivering, we'd be living in their utopia now. Instead, the safety nets that were woven from collective struggle were stripped away, and we're dealing with where the robberies of privatisation, outsourcing, and austerity have brought us to. For example, there's a clear link between this cost of living crisis and privatisation. The Office for National Statistics state that three-quarters of inflationary pressures are from utility bills. But what the population is rarely reminded of is that the huge utilities in energy, water, transport, for example, were plundered for private profit when they could have been directed and their prices controlled by state ownership and progressive taxation. These broader social benefits are obviously even more important in a divided society where the equitable, accountable distribution of resources on the basis of need is essential. This has been a feature of the history of the housing executive, and is why what we're talking about today is more than a debate on funding models and the technicalities of borrowing. The housing executive had to be created for a reason, and it operated in response to a previous sectarian model of provision. It then provided an internationally recognized alternative in terms of the distribution of housing on the basis of need. So we have to campaign to defend the public sector principles on which the housing executive was founded, and we cannot allow inappropriate and damaging market-based solutions to tear this ethos apart. If we look at the destructive consequences of marketization in public sector housing alone, far from it working, we see how the story has moved from the initial propaganda of popular capitalism framed around an individual right to buy, to the reality of over 40% of this stock in England now back in the hands of landlords, charging rents double that formerly set by the local authority. Some of you may be old enough to remember the arguments against the sell-offs of the 1980s, when the point was made that we were in effect, shares were being sold in products that are in things that we already owned, nominally at least, and that over generations we and our forebears, directly and indirectly, had paid to build. The argument then was that while a few individuals may acquire shares, not only would they be swallowed by future, bigger speculators, we would all end up paying a heavy price for the future rental of these necessities. The obvious reason for this is that a profit-seeking market is the enemy of general provision and needs public shortage to increase the price of its involvement. If we look at the local housing stock, for example, the UK government policy's combination of disinvestment in new stock and right to buy saw more than 100,000 housing executive properties sold between 1987 and 1998, a decline of over 17%. This is a policy shift that continued even after devolution and has been described as a post-Troubles double transition towards peace and neoliberalism, the financialization of the economy that demands low pay and privatized services, irrespective of geography, history, or conflict, the pursuit of profit from paper assets, the pursuit of profit from paper assets, the increase of the so-called FIRE, that is finance, insurance, and real estate businesses that are essentially parasitic in nature. Now, given the damage that financialization does, the question arises is why any politician here who isn't ideologically predisposed to such pro-market change would facilitate such a direction of travel. Part of the answer lies in the fact that market-based policy options mirroring English housing policy have become so normalised in policy terms, it creates a there is no alternative mindset, particularly because this is exacerbated by the desperation that flows from long-standing underfunding. In other words, we get used to saying, what else can we do? In terms of funding, strikingly, even before the latest crisis at Stormont, the pre-election 3-year draft budget again showed an acceptance of cuts everywhere but health, with no recognition that the post-pandemic economy could and should look very different. The reason it should be different is that the events of the last 2 years have shown us that the levers that could have been and were deployed in this emergency were always there, and it meant it was entirely unnecessary that we were trapped in the false austerity prison that we're still living with. Indeed, it confirmed that every demand we made for years was, in financial terms, clearly affordable and a mere fraction of the money that states were capable of calling upon should they wish to do so. This period has also reinforced a fact that Stuart has pointed out in his previous research on how easily and readily debt can be written off by the Treasury when it suits their needs, and how it's a supposedly immovable roadblock to any progressive solution to public need. The scale of this sort of write-off can be colossal. For example, in April 2020, Matt Hancock, the then Health Secretary for England and Wales, announced he was cancelling the historic debt owed by over 100 hospitals in England. This internal market debt, from which these institutions were previously told they could not escape, and which for years hindered their ability to deliver public health, was scrapped at the stroke of a pen. This represented the UK government writing off a figure of just less than £13.5 billion. It's useful to put such a figure in a local economic context. It's an amount greater than the full annual Treasury subvention to Northern Ireland. So we need to build on 2 lessons of the last few years that have shown that the money is there and that public health, public services and its workers are the spine of a just society. This is the key to developing and deepening a new civil rights struggle, a struggle that defends and enhances the pillars of public provision, health, housing, education, and the real social security of universal basic services, not welfarism. More generally, it is not just about one union or their members' terms and conditions being protected, but about society being saved from the destruction of the market. We've had no shortage of political crises, talks about talks and red lines over the years here before political restoration precedes the next collapse. No doubt we're set for more of the same in the months ahead. It's vital that the future of public housing specifically and the funding of public services more generally are not lost in a restoration without a peace dividend necessary for reconstruction. In this context, is it inconceivable that economic demands for such a peace dividend could be framed as part of the basis of a return to devolved government? A new executive can and should deliver the recommendations for the Housing Executive and the Department for Communities in Stuart's report and fulfil NICICTU's no going back housing policy that calls for a right to an adequate, secure home that is affordable, a massive programme of public housing construction on public land, and tenant rights and tenants' rights control, rent controls. As Trademark Belfast has stated, the rebuilding of our social space on a stable and secure footing is not possible in a world where people rent their lives and the lives of their children, finance and its standing army of lawyers, accountants, stockbrokers and estate agents. Our future rests with what we hold in common, that is our health, education, housing and infrastructure networks, as these are the things which all modern societies need in order to reproduce themselves in a sustainable way. Its future lies in social ownership of common needs, not their forced enclosure behind paywalls, so that finance, insurance and real estate service gatekeepers can charge an entry fee to the very act of living. So to conclude, the issue of housing has been so distorted that a discussion on it becomes about many things, but not about the core element that matters, that housing should be about how the population as a whole has an affordable, acceptable roof over their heads as of right. This can only be guaranteed with a mass house building programme in order to create a stock of publicly owned, affordable housing. This is why we argue to defend and enhance the original ethos of the Housing Executive and that its future is appropriately funded, politically accountable in the public sector, and free from the spectre of privatisation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John. A real reality check there from you, which beautifully puts into context the campaign that we need to be fighting, and quite rightly across all of the trade union movement, not just NIPSA. You really did explain very, very well the cuts agenda of successive Tory governments and the impact that has had on the most needy in our society, the people who have the most need for shelter, that have the human right to have shelter, and specifically not left out of Stuart's excellent briefing paper. Thank all of our speakers, including Patrick Mulholland, John McVeigh, and of course, Professor Stuart Smith. And thank you again to everybody who's attended this event today. We look forward to very deep, meaningful and extensive engagement on this paper. And as John has rightly said, all of the other issues that arise from it and affect in the Northern Ireland context, the difficulties of austerity and cuts and trying to get them overturned to the benefit of everyone in our society. So thanks very much, folks. And we hope to see you very soon.